band practice and we were getting on the L train and he had bought a 6-pack of Sierra Nevada or like another IPA beer, and I remember like I was taking swigs off of it on the train just like from this paper bag, and I remember thinking to myself, this is really dark for a beer, but there's something about it that's still kind of nice, you know. And like usually when I drink beer, it's typically more something that's like, you know, Blue Moon or something that's like, I don't know, let's say Bud Light Lime on a basis, depending on like where I'm going. If I'm going to my friend's house, like it's usually only everything that he gets. But I don't know, IPAs are kind of nice though. Like I think I've started actually learning to appreciate them a little bit more. Sure as hell, they definitely don't do the same thing that whiskey does to me though, just because like I can drink whiskey and gin like water, but feed me vodka and I will literally become the worst enemy that you've ever seen on the face of the planet. It's like Kim Kardashian kind of just meets another hot mess reality star type of thing, and then I'm just like out there doing God knows what. Yeah, just like vodka and I are not friends. Not friends at all. Well, like, give me whiskey and gin and I will actually be your best friend. I will literally become your best friend. And if there's any cheese at all onto it too, like depending on like whether you're having dinner or whether you're having dessert, if there's any cheese there whatsoever, like I might just end up asking you to marry me. That's just because I grew up on cheese, and I could never try to be a vegan because there's not one thing I'd ever be willing to give up. Just no, absolutely not. It's funny though, because, you know, in this generation, there are a lot more people, you know, and everyone that's, you know, that was born within either the early 90s or the late 80s or like close to like the mid 90s, everyone is just so aware of the things that are happening in this world now, which is very different compared to my siblings who were all born in the 70s. And for them, it's weird because they're adults now, and I'm fairly sure that they also went through the same phase of awareness that a lot of us do nowadays. But it's different because it's not the same feeling as growing up in the 90s and then just being that child who's like at the turn of the century and like growing up with computers, whereas my siblings, you know, they were like in their 20s before they actually figured out like what a computer was. When I was actually like 7 when I got my first computer, this was like maybe the day before Y2K actually happened, and my mom and I went to Comp USA when that was still a thing on 37th and 5th. And you know, I remember like going to all these different chat rooms on like AOL and definitely like ignoring the warnings that everybody was giving. It's like, don't go into these chat rooms because you don't know who you'll be talking to, like that kind of thing. And that's essentially just how I ended up like getting really addicted to the internet. And by the time I was 13, it was just full-fledged and just like that, spending 12 hours a day on the goddamn computer, not even going to class anymore. And I think now it's definitely benefiting a lot of people, and especially those kids who grew up with computers too, because, you know, they could potentially end up doing something that's in computer science, or end up being like a graphic designer, or even just helping people out who don't understand, you know, how to use technology or something that's more challenging to them. They definitely understand it from a different point of view that makes everything simpler to them because they grew up with it. You know, like they grew up in that culture in the same way that my siblings who only have like a 10 to 15 year difference between them and I, you know, they grew up not knowing necessarily how to use computers until they were in their 20s, just because they were born at an earlier date than I was. Now we're in a place where technology is prevalent, and technology might be the downfall of everybody, because let's face it, who isn't addicted to their smartphone nowadays? You know, who doesn't spend their time on the subway either like playing games on their iPhone or just like reading something on their Android or like on their tablets or whatever it is that anybody has. And, you know, even in class nowadays, like, you know, people they're not even allowed to bring cell phones into the building. Otherwise they have to be taken away for the entire day, because kids are there all the time, like all the fucking time, you know. They're like spending their time on social networking websites, you know, like there are schools where even my high school, they had to end up putting like a proxy in the firewall so they could stop kids from actually going onto Facebook, because they spent all of their time doing that during breaks, you know. And that's not something that used to exist about 10 to 15 years ago. But the fact of the matter is, now there are still like 13 and 12-year-old kids now like being on Facebook. And I remember being 13 and definitely like owning a MySpace account and creating that, and I still haven't gotten rid of it almost 8.5 years later. And I definitely don't plan on doing that because I'm just a lazy person. Like, I'm not even going to try and bother dealing with that. But it's different because nobody used to look at your MySpace profile if they wanted to hire you for a job. For example, if you had a job, and if you have a job interview now, people can look at your Facebook and they can look through your pictures and they can look through your profile and say, okay, well, we don't think this person is actually capable, or rather we don't think this person actually fits in the criteria that we're looking for our company. Either like this person parties too hard, or this person does like way too many drugs and we would like to, and we think that that person's they're gonna ruin the reputation of the company. And it just sucks because a lot of people use Facebook as a way to identify themselves with the person they want to be and not the person they really are. Which is why, you know, like a lot of people say like, oh, choose a profile picture, and they'll put something up that doesn't necessarily represent who they are in their every day-to-day lives. But it's, you know, one moment that was just caught, just one moment, like somebody just took a picture at the right time, whether they're at a social gathering, at a concert, or anything, just that one moment in that one picture that they wish could represent who they are entirely as a person, but only just really represents one moment in their lives where everything just went perfect for them. And that's what they choose to display, and that's totally fine. People can do that, you know, the way they want to, but, you know, social networking websites do not represent a person entirely. There are so many different facades that people have, and that, you know, these people walk around with them every single day, and people do wonder, is it possible to ever truly get to know a person? And I think it is, because, you know, granted, what you may see on the internet may represent a fraction of this person's life, but not the whole picture, not the entire thing. And, you know, there are a lot of people who are more open about that kind of stuff, and they just put themselves out there. You know, they put everything on, you know, everything on their Facebook, on their MySpace, on their Tumblr, whatever it is that they use. And they get a lot of criticism for that because, you know, they're open on a social networking website and they're pouring their hearts out there. They're wearing their hearts on their sleeve. They're pouring their emotions out there, and people are judging them for it. And I think that's where a lot of the things come from, in the sense that, you know, a lot of people say it's like, oh, you know, like you're narcissistic, you're self-centered, and like everything is about you because you're interpreting this to be one way when it's actually supposed to be another way. But I think people forget that a lot of different people use the internet and they use these websites, and a lot of people come from very different places. And even if they're, you know, a citizen of the same country that that person might be from, you don't know what their heritage is like, you don't know where their parents come from, and you definitely don't know the ideology that that person grew up with. So there's a huge spectrum, you know, between, let's say it's like me, and if I were talking to one of my best friends, for example, you know, we're still entirely different people, and we may share a lot of things in common. We may have many similar interests, but fact of the matter is, depending on where your parents come from and like your heritage and your culture and your parents' culture and your grandparents' culture, those things will affect you in the way you think and the way you act. And that's going to be the same thing for everyone too. So a lot of people usually have trouble differentiating their own thought process compared to someone else's thought process, regardless of how old they are, whether they're similar and they're in the same age group, or whether they're like 30 to 40 years older, or even like 5 years younger, because they think to themselves, okay, well, maybe you don't think the same way that I do, not necessarily because of the skin color, but also just because of that person's like socioeconomic background and the way they grew up and everything else. And when it comes down to the core of it, a lot of people don't realize that everyone universally is a human being. Everybody has emotions that they all go through, and a lot of them are very similar, but they just learn to deal with it in different ways. And learning to deal with it in those different ways is what really differentiates people, because if they deal with it in different ways, you know, let's say that you're sad because your significant other broke up with you. Some people might say, hey, well, you know what? I don't need to sit around and mope the entire time and just eat a pint of ice cream while watching a movie. No, I'm just going to go on the rebound and find someone else to hook up with, and then I'm just going to deal with that. And, you know, someone else might say, okay, well, I'd rather just sit here and process my feelings and just kind of like let them ride out before I actually put myself back out there. And a lot of people will frown upon that kind of thing because it's like, okay, well, your way of thinking doesn't match my way of thinking, so I'm going to judge you for that because your ideals are not the same ideals that I share, and for that alone, your views are different than mine, so I'm going to judge you based on that, and that makes you less of a good person than I am. And a lot of people forget that everybody is human and everyone deals with things in different ways, and as long as they're not hurting other people, why do you care? Why do you care what they're doing? Because it doesn't affect you. It does not affect you directly. It does not affect you as a person, and what they're doing does not affect you as a being, because they're not trying to get your attention in any way whatsoever. They're just learning to deal with things in a way that feels more comfortable to them. And if you don't agree with that, you are you're more than welcome to tell them that. But at the end of the day, everyone is different, and everyone has different shoes that they walk in. And unless you have a specific idea, and unless you know exactly what that person is going through, you are not allowed to just throw yourself into that person's shoes and be like, okay, well, you're doing this wrong, you should do it this and that way, because that's going to help you deal with the things that you're dealing with. And everybody has different ways of thinking. So, you know, your thought process is not going to be the same as your neighbor's thought process or your best friend's thought process. Everybody else is different, and what they're doing, unless it's directly affecting you in the way that it's hurting you, you really shouldn't have to give any shits at all whatsoever. Because what they're doing, if it's not affecting you, that's not your business. You have a right to care, but you have no right to intervene unless it's affecting you directly, or unless that person is hurting themselves too, in which case you are allowed to step in before that person hurts themselves and it's too late. And I think that that's the problem with this generation, is that a lot of people, you know, they may say they're self-centered and they're trying to fight for a cause, but a lot of people also are not able to see that people think differently, and they're not able to accept the fact that people think differently. So they're usually fighting for that one cause that they believe in, knowing that other people think differently. But if those people think differently, then wouldn't you want to understand why they think differently and what the root cause of that is, as opposed to just attacking their own thoughts and their own being and their own person? Because if you claim to be as open-minded as you are, and as, you know, completely like not prejudiced the way you are, then you would be able to understand that people come from different places. People's parents come from different places. They have different thought processes, and they have different cultures. They come from many different places all throughout the world. And as long as you're able to come to an understanding that everyone is human and that everybody thinks in a different way, but if you're still able to fight for the same cause, I think that's all that really matters. And as long as you guys are able to find that middle ground, and as long as you guys are able to find a way to fight the system that you don't believe in and the system that you want to change, that's really all that should matter. And this is, like my 2.5 beer, and I'm nowhere near as drunk as I feel like I would be if I had had like maybe 4 shots of whiskey or so, but that's really not that bad. But, you know, I think also a lot of kids growing up in the millennial generation that they do, you know, like me being born in 1992, compared to, say, my nephew who was born in 2004, there are definitely things that I would not have gotten away with that my nephew still gets away with now. Like, for example, my nephew was maybe like 2 or 3 or so, and I was living in Paris with my mom. And I was using the computer, and I remember I was trying not to let my nephew use the computer because he was only 2 at the time, and I knew that he didn't know what he was doing because his brain was still developing, and he had absolutely no idea like what these things are. He just sees a keyboard with a bunch of different buttons on the screen. It's just kind of like smash, 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 like all these buttons do all of these different things. And I was like, okay, well, I don't want to let you use this because you could cause some potential damage to this. And I'd really not have to let your grandmother deal with, like, you know, paying $1,200 for another computer and then me being on the shit end of the stick for that because it's all my fault, you know. So my mom, you know, thought it was a good idea because he was only 2 years old at the time, and like, what the hell? Who the hell cares about what the neighbors think? Like, he's only 2. Why not? It's a good idea to let him pee out the window. And I was like, you know, Mom, like, it's not a good idea because that's a behavior he's gonna learn. That's something he's gonna stick to, and that's something that, you know, he's gonna remember this. By the time he's maybe like 12 or so, he's like, yeah, my grandma let me pee out the window all the time, you know, when I was at her house. I'm like, really? Who the hell cares? Because it's not like it's bothering anybody, and just let him whiz out the window. And I'm like, Mom, you know, this is the kind of behavior that he's gonna learn, and that's something that's gonna stick in his head, and that's something that he's gonna, you know, continue doing maybe when he grows up, and that's what's gonna lead to other bad behaviors. And that's not something that you really want to teach your grandchild. Like, I understand you're supposed to spoil them. You know, they're supposed to love them unconditionally, spoil the shit out of them because you're the grandmother and that's what you're supposed to do. But at the same time, remember that there's also a line between what is also just morally supposed to be correct. And in that sense, I mean, like, you know, what's also normal for you to do as opposed to something that is not normal for you to do. But at the same time, it's like, oh, well, he's just a kid and you'll learn about it anyway. Like, you'll figure it out. It's a kid. It's okay. No. Regardless of the age of the person that you're interacting with, there are still principles that are to be had within every person, and it's your job and it's your responsibility, besides the child's mother and the child's father and whoever, like however many siblings that child may have. It's their job, and it's also your job to instill these principles, you know, in your grandchild to make sure that that person doesn't end up, you know, on the streets or committing like God knows how many crimes on the streets. You know, it's like, okay, well, my grandparents taught me that it was okay for me to do so and so and so because they really didn't care about what I was doing because I was just a kid and everything was fine. And lo and behold, before you know it, you're going to be 17, end up in, like in a juvenile detention type of thing where you're going to be tried as an adult because you realize that your parents let you get away with so much shit that essentially nothing else mattered because whatever your parents said, it didn't matter because, hey, my grandma lets me do all of these things. So why the fuck not am I not allowed to do all these things that I want to do? Because my grandma's going to always be there for me. My parents have no authority over what I'm saying. And your life is just gonna fly by you. Every day that you're going to be living in that cell is another day that you're going to be torturing yourself and just asking yourself, why didn't I listen to my parents? Why didn't I listen to the authoritative figures that were in my presence and also just in my family? And I wish I could have avoided all of this. And I just want to live a normal teenage life, and just like go to high school and have all these friends and go to the prom and just like deal with the college process and just everything else, and like, it's very difficult to try and raise a human being, regardless of whether that human being is your child or not. It's very difficult to try and instill these values that you have, and a lot of these different values that you may have, but at the same time your daughter may not share, and you guys may disagree on all of these things. But people have brains and they don't fully mature until they're 21 years old, and even then, everybody's brain is always still developing, and people have the ability to change their opinions, and they have the ability to see things from a different perspective. But when it comes to a child is fragile, and a child has no way of differentiating between what is right or what is wrong. And it's your job as a parent, as a grandparent, as any other relative, regardless of who you are in their lives, it is your job to make sure that that kid does not stray away from the path that is considered to be the path of life. And as long as that kid doesn't end up in jail before the time he has a high school diploma or anything else, or as long as he's settled, you then maybe have done something right. Because as long as you treat that child, as you like putting the child in a stable and a loving and a caring home, being in an environment where you have two loving parents, or even just one parent, because I grew up with one parent for most of my life, and I don't know how I ended up saying the way that I am, knowing that both sides of my family are completely batshit fucking crazy and just live for the drama. As long as you know that you have a supportive environment that's always going to be there for you. They don't even necessarily have to be blood relatives, because the saying blood is thicker than water is total bullshit. Do not believe anybody who says that, because everybody has different subjective experiences that they may have that does not necessarily compare to yours. It's your job to make sure that that kid ends up growing up in a home that is very emotionally stable, and also socioeconomically too, that kid doesn't end up doing petty thievery, or end up conning people or even their friends, just to end up having a little bit of pocket change that you weren't able to provide for your own grandchild or even your nephew or whoever else it might be in your family. Taking care of a child is not as easy as it may look. It's not just where you're babysitting, where you're coming into this other person's home and you're watching their kid for a few hours before you end up going home, and you have no authority over them except for the fact you have to tell them when to go to bed and when to eat and to stop doing so-and-so, but you wish you could discipline them, but they're not your kids, so you can't discipline them. And it gives you an idea of how you would discipline your kids if you ever choose to have any to begin with in the first place. That's your decision. That's totally fine. But it's your job to make sure that kid does not end up on the streets or end up completely dead somewhere with nowhere to go before that kid has a high school diploma, or ends up being in college, or ends up even having a job, not even going to college, who knows. And, every person is different. They have the right to do whatever it is they want to do when they reach that certain age, which definitely does not happen before puberty. It's definitely within a few years afterwards. By the time they're 18 or 19, some of them might end up figuring it out earlier, some of them might end up figuring it out later. But it's your job to make sure that they don't end up falling into the same trap that a lot of people get caught in, and they just end up with nowhere to go, because either they spent all their money and they ended up conning people, or they ended up doing too many drugs, or they ended up just not going to high school and everything else. And if you can't find a way to do that as a parent or as a relative, you shouldn't even just be able to raise a kid in their own way.